The Legacy of Defeat and the Fragile Peace. On September 1, 1939, the German Wehrmacht executed a devastating thrust deep into Polish territory, securing a swift and absolute victory. Yet barely 2 decades prior, the forefathers of these conquering troops had also been on the march, but in the opposite direction, retreating back into their homeland as a vanquished force. In November 1918, after 4 agonizing years of the Great War, Germany's Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was compelled to abdicate his throne. His armies were being inexorably ground down by a remorseless offensive launched by British, French, and United States forces. Meanwhile, his own people faced the specter of starvation at home. However, even amidst the ashes of defeat, a dangerous and corrosive myth was taking root. The German High Command and the rank-and-file soldiery insisted they had not been defeated on the battlefield, but rather, quote, stabbed in the back, unquote, by their own cowardly politicians and revolutionaries. Nevertheless, precisely at 11 in the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns of World War I finally fell silent. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived on European soil, bringing with him the promise of a new world order. He successfully persuaded the world's leaders to subscribe to a new international body, the League of Nations. At the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, the signatories agreed that henceforth, international disputes would be resolved not through the savagery of armed conflict, but through diplomatic debate within the League. The map of the continent was redrawn. The peoples of Europe were ostensibly liberated, and Germany's stalwart ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismantled. From its dissolution, new sovereign nations emerged: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was drastically truncated, stripped of territory and dignity. Yet this geopolitical restructuring contained a dormant time bomb. Not everyone rejoiced at the genesis of nations such as Czechoslovakia. Several of these newly minted states contained substantial ethnic German minorities isolated from their fatherland. One day, the fervent irredentist desire to reunite these Germanic peoples would return to haunt the continent. The war-torn German populace had one final indignity inflicted upon them. They were coerced to paying a staggering £6.6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, a financial burden they could ill afford. However, even amidst the ashes of defeat, when President Wilson returned to America, his vision of a new world order immediately disintegrated. The U.S. Congress determined that it could not risk being entangled in another European conflagration. It refused to join the very league Wilson had championed, and the U.S. withdrew into a period of stoic isolationism. The rise of the dictators. Germany was now a fundamentally transformed nation. It remained Europe's most populous country, but its militaristic monarchy had vanished, replaced by a democracy. However, its government, the fledgling Weimar Republic, was immediately besieged by a series of catastrophic blows. Ferocious street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists attempting to incite a revolution. Then, in 1923, the nation was devastated by an economic cataclysm, hyperinflation. The inflation rate reached astronomical figures, climbing by hundreds of percent per month. The life savings of ordinary citizens were obliterated overnight. This chaotic environment provided fertile soil for a virulent new breed of rabble-rousing right-wing demagogues. Foremost among them was Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, Hitler had fought with distinction as a soldier in World War I, earning the Iron Cross for bravery. Upon returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, where his fiery and hypnotic oratory soon enabled him to seize control of the diminutive National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. In October 1923, Hitler and his cohorts attempted an armed insurrection, the Beer Hall Putsch, against the Weimar government. The coup failed dismally, and he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. During his incarceration, he dictated a manifesto, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he attributed Germany's misfortunes to Jewish conspiracies and demanded that the nation rebuild its martial strength to seek Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Upon his release, he dedicated himself to restructuring the Nazis into a disciplined professional political entity. From this point forward, he resolved to utilize the democratic system to dismantle democracy itself. For the subsequent 5 years, however, Weimar Germany enjoyed a relative period of prosperity. Public support for extremist parties on both the left and the right dwindled. Then, suddenly, history presented Hitler with his golden opportunity. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Billions of dollars evaporated, and a crushing economic depression swept across the globe. Unemployment in Germany skyrocketed to over 6 million individuals. In this climate of despair, only extremist politicians seemed to offer viable solutions. Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, the Nazis had evolved into a genuine mass movement, supported by their own paramilitary wing, the brown-shirted stormtroopers, whose ranks numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis emerged as the largest single party in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. Hitler refused to join a coalition government, leaving the parliament in a state of paralysis. To break the impasse, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him chancellor in January 1933, effectively making him the head of government. Within a month, the Reichstag building was consumed by flames. Hitler immediately accused the communists of arson and demanded emergency powers. He then utilized those powers to systematically outlaw all opposing political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler promptly declared himself president as well as chancellor. He was now the absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. The illusion of peace and the gathering storm. Initially, there was little indication of the horrors to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer concentrated on revitalizing Germany's shattered economy. He poured millions into massive public works projects, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn network, effectively absorbing the unemployed workforce. However, under the cloak of secrecy, Hitler was also spending lavishly on a colossal rearmament program. Under the strictures of the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been capped at 100,000 men. The country was strictly forbidden from possessing an air force, tanks, or submarines. Hitler ignored these mandates. The small army was tripled in size. Then, in 1935, he discarded the veil of secrecy. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe, boasting 2,500 aircraft, a force significantly larger than that of Britain or France. Unemployment plunged, and the Nazi regime became enormously popular. Now emboldened, the Führer made his first expansionist maneuver. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saarland district on the French border after its population voted to return from the League of Nations administration to German rule. A year later, he marched German troops into the Rhineland, a region of Germany that had been demilitarized by Versailles. At the time, many international observers felt that Hitler was merely reclaiming what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France raised a significant objection. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, The Nazi regime was perceived by many visitors as firm but fair, a government that was restoring national pride without threatening its neighbors. Of course, there were ominous signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws forbade Jewish citizens from marrying true Aryan Germans and stripped them of their citizenship rights. But when the first genuine threats to world peace emerged, they did not originate from Hitler, but from the other side of the world. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan was already established as a formidable military power. It had vanquished Russia in the War of 1905 and had fought alongside the Allies during World War I. In the post-war era, Japan was an acknowledged world power and a signatory to the League of Nations. Yet politically, the nation was a complex paradox. Nominally a democracy, Japan's feudal traditions remained deeply entrenched. Most Japanese citizens revered their emperor as a living deity, regarding him as their true and absolute leader. Furthermore, the country faced critical economic challenges. Its population was exploding, yet it possessed no natural resources to fuel its rapidly expanding industrial base. Its leaders required solutions, and they cast their gaze toward Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a region of fertile grain fields, abundant coal and mineral deposits. It was the perfect objective. Japanese troops were already stationed there to guard railways. Other potential targets included the resource-rich colonies ruled by European powers, Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong controlled by Britain, Indochina ruled by France, and the Dutch East Indies. However, at this juncture, Japan had to exercise caution. They did not wish to provoke the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. Despite its anti-imperialist rhetoric, the U.S. administered an unofficial empire in the Pacific, with the Philippines, Guam, and several other islands under its direct rule. It undoubtedly possessed the strength to challenge Japan, but since the conclusion of World War I, America had been preoccupied. This was the Jazz Age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation concentrated on exploiting its own vast resources. An economic boom seemed to stretch endlessly into the future, with fortunes made in both industry and the stock markets. America seemed lost in the increasing pursuit of hedonism and pleasure. With such distractions, Japan's growing pains seemed very far away. America had slashed its army size after World War I and agreed to a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. In effect, this handed naval superiority in the Western Pacific to the Japanese. Then came the Great Depression. As economic devastation spread, 25% of the American population lost their employment. Tens of thousands were rendered homeless, living in destitute shanty towns. Whereas before it had been distracted by pleasure, America was now consumed by pain. It was time for Japan to make her move. In 1931, without so much as informing their own elected government, Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital, Mukden, and subsequently overran the entire territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet ruler, Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who was dragged out of retirement. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations faced its first supreme test. Japan was universally condemned. However, the Japanese response was blunt. They simply walked out of the assembly. The League suddenly realized it was powerless to intervene in Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, yet it remained indifferent. Its leaders turned their eyes toward further conquests in China, which offered easy pickings. China was in a state of chaos. The nationalist government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in a bitter conflict with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. It was a civil war. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, Japan signed a pact with Hitler to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia. Then, in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and launched a full-scale invasion. Initially taken by surprise, the Chinese fought back fiercely, with the Communists and the Kuomintang forming a united front. The Japanese responded with amphibious landings and indiscriminate bombing. By the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China and the coastal regions. The Japanese prosecuted this war with exceptional brutality. After capturing Nanjing, then the Chinese capital, on December 17, 1937, the Japanese forces unleashed a campaign of terror. It is estimated that over 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were massacred during a 6-week period of rape, looting, and indiscriminate killing. Despite attacks on British and U.S. warships, including the sinking of the American gunboat Panay, where 50 crewmen died, the Western powers refused to intervene militarily. President Roosevelt wished to impose a naval blockade, stating, "It has become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world have far-reaching effects on us." However, the British, fearing war, refused. China was left to fight alone. The failure of the West and the Axis alliance. In 1938, the Japanese pushed deeper into Western China. The rhetoric of the League of Nations had amounted to nothing. Meanwhile, the Western powers faced aggression much closer to home. Today, it is easy to mock Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. His posturing seems faintly ridiculous in retrospect, but in 1922, it was deadly serious. Italy had appeared to be on the brink of anarchy, riven by strikes and land seizures. Mussolini, a war veteran and journalist, organized the right-wing fascist party, and in October 1922 ordered his black shirts to march on Rome. Fearing civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III asked him to form a government. Mussolini swiftly dismantled the opposition, assuming dictatorial powers. Like Hitler, his early public works programs and anti-corruption drives made him immensely popular. He rebuilt the armed forces and launched a powerful navy. He became a source of inspiration for aspiring autocrats worldwide, including Hitler. But Mussolini craved imperial glory. His target was Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. In December 1934, Italian forces provoked a border clash. Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations, but the League stalled. In October 1935, Italy invaded. The primitive Abyssinian forces stood little chance against modern artillery, tanks, and chemical weapons like mustard gas. After 6 months, the country was conquered. The League imposed weak economic sanctions that had no effect. Mussolini's aggression revealed that the League was impotent and that Britain and France, traumatized by World War I and weakened by the Depression, had no stomach for a fight. France, facing a declining birth rate and manpower shortage, adopted a purely defensive strategy, the Maginot Line, a vast string of fortifications along the German border. This defensive mentality meant France lacked the capacity to launch offensive operations to stop aggression elsewhere. The stab in the back, Italy's mutilated victory. To understand why Italy joined forces with Hitler, a man Mussolini initially despised, we must look back to the peace tables of 1919. Italy had fought on the side of the Allies in World War I. They had lost over 600,000 men in brutal Alpine warfare against the Austrians. In return, the British and French had secretly promised them vast territories along the Adriatic coast and in the colonies. But at Versailles, those promises were broken. President Woodrow Wilson, championing self-determination, blocked Italy's claims. The Italians left the peace conference humiliated. The nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio coined the phrase "vittoria mutilata," the mutilated victory. This national resentment was the fuel that Mussolini poured on the fire. He convinced the Italian people that the Western democracies were greedy hypocrites who wanted to keep Italy poor and weak. For years, Britain and France tried to keep Mussolini on their side, forming the Stresa Front in 1935 to contain Hitler. But the deep-seated bitterness of 1919, combined with the sanctions over Abyssinia, finally pushed Il Duce into the arms of the Führer. The mutilated victory of the First World War had directly birthed the Pact of Steel of the Second. The American silence, the Neutrality Acts. While the aggressor nations sharpened their knives, the world's greatest industrial power deliberately tied its own hands. In the mid-1930s, the United States was undergoing a profound crisis of conscience. A Senate investigation, led by Gerald Nye, the Nye Committee, shocked the American public. It suggested that the U.S. had been tricked into entering World War I by greedy arms manufacturers and bankers, the so-called merchants of death, who had profited from the slaughter. The backlash was furious. The American public demanded that their government never again be dragged into a European quarrel. Congress responded by passing a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937. These laws were rigid and absolute. They forbade the sale of arms to any nation at war, regardless of who was the aggressor and who was the victim. They also forbade American ships from carrying goods to belligerent nations. The intention was to keep America safe. The result was a catastrophe for world peace. When Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese warlords looked at America, they saw a giant that had voluntarily put itself into a coma. They realized they could attack smaller nations without fear that the United States would intervene or even sell weapons to their victims. The Neutrality Acts effectively gave the dictators a green light. It signaled that the Atlantic Ocean was a wall behind which America would hide, leaving the democracies of Europe to face the storm alone. The economics of war. Behind the marching bands and the military parades lay a cold, hard economic reality. Both Germany and Japan were terrified of one thing: suffocation. In World War I, the British naval blockade had starved Germany into submission. Hitler and his planners were obsessed with ensuring this could never happen again. They did not just want territory for glory, they wanted it for survival. This was the doctrine of autarky, total economic self-sufficiency. In 1936, Adolf Hitler placed Hermann Göring in charge of the four-year plan. The goal was to make the German army and economy ready for war within 4 years. But Germany lacked the very lifeblood of modern warfare: oil and rubber. They also lacked sufficient iron ore and food. This economic panic drove strategy. Hitler looked east to the Ukraine and Russia not just for living space, but for the grain to feed his people and the oil to fuel his tanks. He knew that without conquering these resources, Germany would run out of fuel within months of a major conflict. Halfway across the world, Japan faced an even desperate calculus. The Japanese archipelago was devoid of natural resources. As they modernized, their need for oil, steel, and scrap metal soared, commodities they had to import almost entirely from the United States. The Japanese military leadership realized a terrifying truth: their entire war machine existed at the mercy of American exports. This dependency was unacceptable to the proud nationalist spirit of the Imperial Army. To be truly independent, Japan felt compelled to seize the resource-rich territories of the Southern Resource Area, the Dutch East Indies, and British Malaya. Thus, the road to war was paved not just with hate, but with a desperate, predatory hunger for raw materials. The dress rehearsal, the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain, a vicious conflict pitting the left-wing Republican government against right-wing nationalists. When a military coup led by General Francisco Franco stalled, he turned to Hitler and Mussolini for aid. Hitler saw an opportunity to test his revitalized military. He sent the Condor Legion of the Luftwaffe and 12,000 troops, along with the first Panzer tanks. Mussolini contributed 50,000 troops. While Britain and France declared a policy of non-intervention, the Soviet Union sent aid to the Republicans, and 30,000 volunteers, the international brigades, joined the fight against fascism. The war was brutal. The bombing of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937, which killed 6,000 civilians, shocked the world. Ultimately, the professional soldiers of Franco, backed by Axis firepower, ground down the Republic. Madrid fell in March 1939. Franco's victory confirmed to Hitler that the democracies were too weak to resist him. Part 7. The Road to Warsaw. Hitler now accelerated his plans. His ultimate aim was clear: expansion in the East. In 1938, he turned his sights on his homeland, Austria. In March, he sent in troops and in a bloodless invasion known as the Anschluss, incorporated Austria into the Third Reich. Next was Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, home to a large German minority. Hitler threatened war. In a desperate bid for peace, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met Hitler in Munich in September 1938. They signed an agreement handing the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for a promise of no further expansion. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper, proclaiming peace for our time. The peace lasted barely 6 months. In March 1939, Hitler broke his word and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. He then demanded the return of Danzig from Poland. Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand, guaranteeing Poland's independence. Hitler, anticipating Western weakness, played his final card. In August 1939, the world was stunned when Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Secretly, they agreed to carve up Poland between them. Secure in the knowledge that he faced no threat from the East, Hitler gave the order. On the evening of August 31st, the German Wehrmacht moved into position. The Führer had made the decision that would plunge the world into its darkest hour.